Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Karen Tucker, CEO of the Churchill Club, and welcome to all of you. We have a very exciting program in store for us here during the lunchtime, led by Rich Karlgaard with Marvin Odum, President of Shell Oil Company, and Khong, Senior Political Analyst and Scenarios Expert at Shell. Thank you all very much for being here as well. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to Shell for their partnership and generosity in making this program possible. Please join me in thanking them. A brief introduction for our new guests in the audience. Churchill Club is Silicon Valley's premier independent business and technology forum. For just about 28 years, we have been convening Silicon Valley-style gatherings where like minds can connect with ideas and with each other. And we are a member-supported nonprofit organization, and if you would like to join us, we would welcome you to do so, and we do have free student memberships. We have an outstanding set of programs coming up over the next month or so and beyond, including the ARM incoming CEO Simon Segars on May 9 in San Francisco, Massive Sensors and Data on May 15, and the 15th annual Top 10 Tech Trends on May 23rd. These are just some of the programs coming up, so be sure to keep an eye on us either via the website or get yourself on our mailing list. If you're tweeting today, please use the hashtag Churchill Club, and you will find other Twitter codes in your printed programs. Our moderator, Rich Karlgaard, is the publisher of Forbes, the world's most popular business and financial magazine, read by 5.5 million people per issue. And in each one of those issues, Rich writes a column called Innovation Rules, which covers economic and technology trends, business transformation, and conversations with leading CEOs. And he frequently lectures on these subjects, and he's also a regular panelist on the Fox News Channel's Forbes on Fox. He is an entrepreneur at heart. He started 2 magazines, Upside and Forbes ASAP, 1 venture capital firm, Garage Technology, and the Bay Area's leading technology and business forum, the Churchill Club, in 1985, for which he was co-awarded an Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year award. Rich is an active angel investor, and he sits on several corporate boards. And he also has 2 books coming out in 2014, one about leading teams and the other called The Soft Edge. We're very fortunate to have him here today to lead the conversation. Please welcome Rich, who will then introduce our guests of honor.
Well, thank you, Karen, for that generous introduction. It's with great excitement that we get to have really a meeting of the minds between one of the great energy producers in the world, meeting one of the great innovation hotbeds of the world, Silicon Valley. And we're going to explore how we have probably more in common and depend on each other's different views of innovations and different time scales than perhaps would be apparent on the surface. And I'm going to leave a lot of time for audience questions. So I'm going to go to audience questions sooner rather than later. And I will announce when I do. But please think of the questions to ask them. And these are 2 gentlemen that are really open to almost any kind of question you might ask them. To my immediate left, Marvin Odum is the president of Shell Oil Company and upstream director of Royal Dutch Shell's subsidiary companies in the Americas. He directs a broad portfolio from traditional oil and gas development to emerging technologies in a wide range of areas, including heavy oil, onshore gas, light tight oil, deep water, and wind and biofuels. At the far end is Khong. He's the chief political analyst in the global business environment team at Shell International, with close to 20 years of experience in leading and participating in country scenario projects. He advises on political trends and political risks for the Shell Group and leads the external environmental assessments for Shell's country reviews. He was actively involved in developing the 1995, 1998, 2001, and 2008 sets of Shell global scenarios, the 2008 Shell energy scenarios, and the 2013 new lens scenarios. Now, interestingly, Marvin is, Shell, as you know, is sort of co-located in London and The Hague. Marvin is in Houston, and Cho is in London. So let's first of all talk about energy and just as an industry and its importance to growth in the US and global economies, because both the US and global economies right now are growing, I think everyone suspects, at a less than robust rate. The US first quarter growth was at 2.5% GDP on an annual basis, and now every economist that I've talked to, and it seems to be showing up in the payroll figures, says even that modest 2.5 is slowing down. Global growth is slowing down. So what are you seeing, first of all, and where does energy fit into reviving global and domestic growth?
Yeah, well, it probably makes sense to start thinking domestically. And of course, if you look back in the history of this country or the history of this continent, you see these spurts of dramatic economic growth, the foundation of the economy we have now. And it's really built on a backbone of energy. And abundant and affordable energy, I'd say, are the most important components of that in terms of what we've seen in the past. And so what's happening right now, particularly with the just vast amount of natural gas that's been discovered in these new resources, which really is an innovation and a combination of technologies which we could come back to. But it's the discovery of this vast resource which can be produced, and it can be produced the right way from an environmental perspective at very low cost, that's now feeding this economy and lowering power bills, and I don't know if you're seeing it here, but we're seeing it across the country, and providing low-cost feedstocks, both in terms of power, but also in terms of materials for manufacturing. And you're now starting to see this resurgence of manufacturing in the US. So to me, it's just another in a long history of examples of how energy can drive, the economy.
Well, here's an example, I think, of how the Silicon Valley view of the world and your view of the world might differ. If you were to poll people in Silicon Valley and ask them the most important invention of the last 30 years, it might be something like search. It might be social networks or something like that. If you were to ask people in your industry, it would be probably horizontal drilling, right?
Yeah. So it's one example. So to produce all of this natural gas that we've talked about, which has a draw to it because it's of the fossil fuels that are out there, it's the cleanest of the fossil fuels. And this is gas that we've actually known about for several decades. But it's the ability, just as you say, Rich, it's the ability to drill horizontal. And you'll hear those in the industry describe this as being able to go thousands of feet, drill down even for a couple of miles, take a 90-degree turn, drill thousands of feet horizontally, and hit a target, smaller than the size of this stage, accurately every time. So you take that technology and combine, another topic, which is hydraulic fracturing, and suddenly this gas that's been in the ground that we've known about for decades has gone from being a nuisance item to being, the primary source of energy potentially for the country.
Well, I was recently in North Dakota just last week. I was born and raised there, and you may have heard of some finding called the Bakken Oil and Gas Reserve, and indeed it's 2 miles down, and it exists in about a 50-foot layer. So right away, the drilling has to be extraordinarily precise. And people always knew it was there. They knew it in the 1960s when there was a mini oil boom, in the 80s when there was a mini oil boom, and now. But Harold Hamm, the Oklahoman, who will go a step further than you, that's because he's probably full of Oklahoma hyperbole, but...
He could hit a target the size of this.
Oh, he said he can pick your lock. He can go down 2 miles, take a 90-degree turn, and pick the lock to your front door.
Yeah, well, it's close.
Well, last question, well, it won't be the last question, but I'll get on to Cho, but the other fundamental difference, I think, between your industry and the industries exist here is that a long-term view in Silicon Valley would be 5 years, maybe 2 or 3 turns of Moore's law. Yeah. But you guys have to think out decades and decades and decades. not because perhaps you want to, but you're so capital intensive and have to incorporate so many political risk scenarios that Cho will talk about, that unless you do that, you could leave yourselves really vulnerable. Can you talk a little about the really long-range nature?
Yeah, there is just a fundamental aspect of the business that drives us to that. So, we as a company invest, currently about $33 billion a year in new projects. So every year, $33 billion building new energy projects, which have a lifespan of, I'd say on the shortest part of the scale, a decade, but typically 2, 3, and even 4 or more decades. So, that fundamental element drives you to be sure you're thinking long-term about this business, because those enormous investments have to make sense in a world that can change fairly dramatically. So balancing that sort of risk, along with country risk and other pieces, I think it's the way we run the business. But before you leave this topic, I think you highlight that as a difference maybe in terms of how we think of timescales. I think the one strong common element, but at least my interpretation of what happens in this area in our business, is this sense of innovation. The sense of every aspect of this business is as stagnant as people think energy is. Every aspect is changing all of the time. And it's the strongest element that we can drive inside our company and really inside this industry to make the kind of progress we need, is that sense of innovation.
Well, I want to come back to that, and I want to particularly come back to how Silicon Valley companies can work with companies like yours. But I want to start with Cho. Can you describe the scenario planning that takes place at Shell and why you're in London, and how you sort of game out political and economic risks throughout the world?
Well, Rich, I mean, I could be anywhere in the world, but at the end of the day, I like to be in a place that's global, where I can see all the different influences around me, where people will come through, will pass through, and where there is at least a nucleus of experts and others that I would like to talk with. Because at the end of the day, we're a small team. We're 15 people, plus or minus a few, inside of the company, inside of Royal Dutch Shell. But our strength lies in coming up with these big picture scenarios, looking out over the long term. Our strength lies in the networks that we have, both inside of the companies. There's tremendous knowledge and expertise inside the company, but also very, very important outside the company as well. So we each of us within this team, we bring to the table our own networks, who we know outside in the world at large, whom we like to consult. I mean, Peter Schwartz is sitting here somewhere in the audience, once called these people remarkable people. They're people we need to listen to. They're people very often we feel our senior managers, our senior executives should also hear from time to time as appropriate. So it's drawing in the internal as well as the external networks and building on these strengths to develop the scenarios that we have. So in a way, we're like synthesizers of knowledge that's already out there, but coming together and putting this knowledge in the form of stories about the future, but they're really all about the present, recognizing that the present never stops changing. Now, if you say, if you ask me what's the analogy I like to use to describe my team, I would say we're a team of window cleaners. We clean the windows of the building that we're in so that people like Marvin and others who have to make the big decisions can see the world much more clearly, can contextualize, put into context the decisions they have to take, the business decisions on energy, in a broader frame, and see where it fits within that much wider context.
Well, much of that then is based on assumptions of economic growth, not only globally, but country by country, region by region. The economy is struggling to get back to its previous rates of growth since the recession. Will it, or are we in an entirely new scenario right now where 2% in the United States is the new normal, and maybe only 3% globally is the new normal?
Rich, we're in a time of great change, and that's something we recognize. Now, that's a commonplace. We all know that. In 2008, when we developed the long-term energy scenarios of the time, I think the fundamental conclusion we drew from those long-term energy scenarios was that a fundamental transformation in the energy system is inevitable. And what we've learned since then, and what we try to bring out into 2013 work, which has just come out, is that we face fundamental transformations on a number of fronts. On the global economy, on individual national economies, we think there's going to be no return to what we used to call the Great Moderation. Economies, both in the developed world as well as in the developing world, are challenged to reinvent themselves, to fit how the world is changing around them. There's a geopolitical and fundamentally at heart also an economic shift, we call that from west to east, the rise of the large developing countries, what it means. In energy terms, is of course what we look at, but it is a wider question than that, bigger question than that. And of course, what we see increasingly around the world are peoples demanding change from their governments, from their leaders, from big business as well. They want to see a better world, and it's our responsibility to try to help deliver it.
One of the assumptions, Cho, is that the world, really led by Deng Xiaoping in China, has been moving toward, in fits and starts, but generally moving toward a more market-based systems. Even the economies in Europe and the United States were transformed by a more pro-market bias in the 1980s. So when you are thinking about these things, do you think that progression will continue, or do you think there will be populist uprisings that will halt that progress?
You know, Rich, we look out over 100 years. Now wind back to, we're in 2013, wind back to 1913 and ask yourself, what could we have foreseen would have been
what could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? Well, in a place called Sarajevo, and just the next year, something did happen, which sparked off a global conflict, ultimately, which was to dominate the first half of the 20th century. But certain trends, I think, if you were perceptive enough, you could have picked out. The rise of the United States, for instance, as the world's leading global power. Some people might also have identified Germany as the leading European power. Now, it did go through a few interesting twists and turns on the way, but more or less, I think we might say it's reached that dominant position within Europe today. But perhaps the actual course might not have been foreseen. Now, take China. I think you might have been forgiven for not picking that one up, though that came to dominate our perception of the global economy and the global polity only very late into the 20th century. So I think what we see, the China phenomenon, you refer to Deng Xiaoping. Yes, I mean, market systems. It was Deng Xiaoping's, I think, big learning experience when he went to visit countries in Southeast Asia.
Well, like Singapore. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew.
Absolutely.
As Lee Kuan Yew tells it, it was Deng Xiaoping's, the scales fell off his eyes in seeing the rapid progress from Singapore as really a very poor country in the early 1960s to by the late 1970s being on its way.
Absolutely, and I lived through that change. And as far as Deng was concerned, it was a question of what are we missing out from? So this question is, I think, increasingly asked by governments and by people everywhere. And to the extent that they can move, they will move. So I think progress in that sense will continue. The nature of that progress will change. What we understand by growth rates may well change as well. We have two scenarios. We call them mountains and scramble, mountains and oceans in our new scenarios that have just come out. Now, in mountains, we have a slower rate of economic growth because there's more focus on consolidation, on social consolidation, of moving everyone forward together, greater role for the state, and more long-term planning. In oceans, it's a much more effervescent, vibrant world. People trying all sorts of ideas, successful exemplars being copied elsewhere. And it is that sense of reinvention that lies at the heart of the more rapid rate of economic growth that we see in an oceans context. Now, the thing about rapid economic growth in the world that we have today is that we're also seeing that rebalancing that was upset by the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century in Europe. So what we see now is other people recognizing how to do it and getting in on the act. So China was the first. We will see India, Brazil, others coming in as well. But this increasing, rising demand for energy will put pressure on prices. And that's when I think you will get to see people being pushed by the market, by the price signal, to look for more efficient ways in which we use energy, to look for new forms of energy as well. That's when renewables get a lead into the picture.
Well, I want to ask Marvin about that, but I want to ask first a general question and then get to this how you think about renewables and how you think about using the kind of great technology that Silicon Valley produces in terms of its sensor technology, its social network technology, its great software to add incredible efficiencies to your industry. But general question, oil companies never make people's favorite companies. Polls show that.
Right, always on my list.
Well, always on your list. And where are the people right and where are they misinformed?
Well, I do actually think energy companies can be a very misunderstood entity, and I'm gonna go straight to that question, but I just wanted to make a comment on how we use. As you asked Joe questions about the scenarios, maybe it's informative for people to understand that this group develops these scenarios independent of the management team of the company.
Absolutely.
And that's part of the process, is then those are then delivered to us as the leaders in the company. And we take what the danger, I think, is fairly conventional thinking about how this business is going to progress over the next decades. And we have to test those theories in these stories or these scenarios that Joe and the team put together. And I have to tell you, it really does open your mind and make you think differently about what you're doing. So that's the power of this piece. I think the misconception around at least the large energy companies like I'm part of is, the feedback I get a lot is they see us, sitting around a big table in a room talking about how to defend our business. The oil production, gas production, keep miles per gallon low and so forth. And it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, we sit around this table as a group of leaders and say, what is going to be happening to the world over the next decades? How is this transformation around energy, which is going to happen? How will it happen? When will it happen? How do we drive that? How do we make sure we have a business model that then works in those new energy pathways? And we think about our investments both today, but then also think, clearly in this 2025 to 2050 world about how we need to position ourselves from the type of people we need to develop, the kind of technologies that we're going to need, and then how we, and I think maybe related to what happens in this part of the world as well, how we keep our fingertips out there sensing where are the breakthrough technologies potentially coming from. And it's not just monitoring. I mean, when I say stimulate, I mean putting some investments into venture capitalist firms, into real innovators that are thinking about that seed funding those activities, and then looking to grow those if they prove to be valid.
Well, Cho talked about, and then I'll come back to you, Cho, about the UN assumes that by 2050 there will be 9 billion people, so an increase of 2 billion. The global economy, since being unleashed and its energies really loosened since the 1980s, has done this wonderful job of elevating anywhere between 1 billion to 2 billion people from poverty to the middle class, but we're still producing still leaving 1.5 billion that aren't there yet, and we're going to have 2 more billion by 2050. So there will be this pressure on energy pricing. How do you specifically think about that? And then what is the alternative energy supply? How does that factor into your thinking?
It's one of the most fascinating things about this business for me is it depends on what angle you want to come at it from. So for example, if you come at it purely from an environmental standpoint, you use today as the status quo, then you might come to the conclusion, well, there's no way we can continue to grow like this because the earth from an environmental standpoint can't stand it. If I come at it strictly from a population point of view, and say 9 billion people and these 1.5 that have no access to electricity now, in addition to the 2 billion additional, you bring in that 1.5 billion, you might come to the conclusion of we better develop every possible energy as fast as we can, otherwise there won't be enough. And so it's a matter of making all of these various elements converge. I think in the analysis that we do that would indicate if you stayed status quo and you grow to 9 billion people, you could need 3 times the amount of energy the world demands today by the middle of this century. If you then factor in, what will obviously happen in terms of efficiency gains and new technologies and so forth, then you start to come closer to this number of a doubling of energy demand. That's a pretty staggering figure when you think about the entire world needing twice as much energy as it needs today. And then as we work that through, not just in a conceptual sense, but with Cho's group and others, actually work through the details of forcing yourself into the thought process of what will happen to oil? What will happen to renewables over that time frame? What will the breakthroughs look like? How fast can they grow with reasonable investment that companies can make and government policy can drive? And you know, I see a picture that will vary depending on the assumptions you make, but still shows us a world that's utilizing as its energy mix something on the order of 65% fossil fuels, with the remainder made up of renewables and nuclear.
And right now, what's the ratio?
Well, it's probably 80 to 85% now, would you say? So, and I think the thing about, you know, so that's a very disappointing picture to a lot of people that are concerned about fossil fuel production and consumption. But if you take, again, come at it from a different way and you look at the pace of growth that's required in renewables to make that happen, that's something that would be unmatched in history to this point in time. We've never grown anything that quickly from an energy point of view. So yeah,
Yeah, I was just going to add to what
and by the way, after Cho's, we're going to start opening it up for audience questions. So upon completion of Cho's remarks here, think of your question, raise your hand, and we'll get a mic to you.
Okay, I was just going to add, Rich, to what Marvin's just said, that just 3 quick points, if I may. Firstly, when we look at energy consumption, there are 2 big things that matter in addition to population growth. One is, of course, the rate of urbanization. We see that happening around the world as people move into cities. And we see a
which is good, because, I mean, the footprint per population in a city is less
well,
than
the pattern of energy consumption will change. And of course, there are more efficient and more energy efficient and less energy efficient cities. And it's trying to organize cities in ways which are much more energy efficient. But that's one question we look at. And the other question, which is a big one, is when we look at where energy demand has really been growing, is in those countries which have been growing economically very rapidly. Now, today, China, tomorrow, India, Brazil, and so on. These countries will grow, and it's that rate of economic growth that we look at, and that's causing this huge increase in demand for fossil fuels. Now, at some point in the future, that demand will start to turn down as the economies mature, and you'll get a pattern of energy demand more like the developed OECD world. But the question for us is, how fast can you push that turnaround towards where we are today? How can you shorten that, you know, that lead time before you get a much more efficient energy use in the large developing countries? So those are 2 of the big things. And finally, to add to Marvin's point about fossil fuels, yes, we posit huge growth in multiple terms for renewables. Solar is a big winner in the second of our scenarios, oceans. But fossil fuels remain inevitably a significant component of the energy mix. Having said that, that's why thinking about climate, technologies like carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, become very, very important.
Well, I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions about your views on climate change and what is to be done or not to be done, and you can always get a robust discussion on that topic. But we have our first questioner over here, and I can see the hands going up.
Do you want us to say who we are? Okay.
And could you kindly state your name?
Yes, my name is Laura Demons, and I would like to see if you could comment, please, on the intersection of water and energy. And when you talk about availability in the coming decades, which do you see being more available, and the implications of the 2, the synergies and the implications of availability of the 2?
Maybe I'll just make a couple of comments, but then Cho will add to what I say. I think if you ask me, in my own perception, what's changed quite a bit in the last 5 years, it's the whole concept of water and water demand and that whole picture for the globe. And again, you see these pretty striking numbers, and I'm not sure I'll get them exactly right, but the UN numbers around water demand increasing over the next 20 years, and the potential shortages, I mean, vast potential shortages of water. So we work on something that we call the stress nexus, water, energy, and food being 3 resource demands where not only are they going to create stress around the world, but they also are clearly interlinked. And how do we go about solving those problems? And I think taking a strong recognition that you can't do them independently. You know, the drive for CO2 emissions might tell you to start to replace gasoline with biofuels, lower CO2 emissions biofuels. So you can do that. You can drive, you could start growing, feedstock material for biofuels all over the world. But if that requires irrigation, you're just exacerbating the water problem and you create another stress.
And you're driving up food prices.
And potentially driving up food prices, exactly. So it's just a good description, I think, of the interlinkage here. So we work, that's the space we try to work in, but we also try to engage governments and civil society, NGOs and others, and increasingly pull ourselves together so that, as opposed to working independently like would be the norm in the past, we can work those issues together.
Yeah, I mean, the analogy I would have is like being trapped inside a box. You move towards one limit and you find you have to turn left or right, then you hit another limit and you keep going. But you have that finite room for maneuver, and you have to recognize that all these various parameters are interlinked. It's a rare learning experience for me, Rich. I joined the Shell Scenario team in 1994, a good way back, and right at the start, climate and climate concerns were one of the issues that we debated within the team. Now, our understanding of climate, I believe, has become more sophisticated, and what we recognize now is the linkages between climate, water, energy, food production, and so on. I mean, these are all interlinked, and it's not climate temperature rise per se that's going to hit us first. It's climate variability, and that has immediate effects on flooding, on drought, and so on.
Let me just add something to Lori, because I think what both of us did is we just expanded on your question, saying, yeah, there really is a problem here. So we do ask ourselves, so what can we do about it today? And so particularly for energy and water, energy is a big water user around the world. And what you recognize is in different parts of the world for different types of energy, that formula will vary quite a bit. But the science wasn't there. It's not intuitive exactly what that is. So we sponsored a study through the World Business Council of Sustainable Development, and I think the University of Utrecht, and basically went out and measured that and modeled that around the world. So for gas-fired power, for nuclear, for coal, for whatever sort of energy sources you might be using, what's the water consumption profile, both by energy type and by geography? And then we provided that model to anybody that wants it. So it's out there to be used now. So now we can have a science-based discussion rather than where we started, of course, which is conceptually, yeah, it's a big problem.
Next question.
Carrie Haley with SPS. So my question gets back
Can you
to...
hold the mic a little closer, yeah.
Sure. Gets back to the innovation of hydraulic fracturing. So the question is, going beyond that innovation, what is Shell looking for to solve the attendant issues around transportation, infrastructure, everything, and the Bakken's a great example. If you've been to Minot, they say, why not? Friesen's the reason.
And you're among the rare people who even pronounces it correctly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but it's, there's only a certain number of roads that you can transport vehicles across. So there's huge infrastructure challenges. There's labor shortages. There's skills shortages. There's lots of areas on the planet, not just here in the U.S., where development of taking advantage of those shale gas resources for cheaper feedstock, energy source on, onshore energy independence. What are the challenges you're looking maybe for this group to innovate in to help solve rail cars that can transport the gas? So I guess the attendant infrastructure and other innovations that need to occur to assist in the real development.
Yeah, and I'd drop them into two categories. So the things we can do absolutely today, and the things where we ought to be putting research and development dollars so that we have a better option in the future. And I think about an area like the Marcellus shale development in Pennsylvania. It's kind of a highly controversial area in some sense, so it's a good one to choose. Now that's an area that we've been in for less than 5 years now, and we're already to a point where we recycle 99-point-something% of the water in that system, water that we use and water that we produce from these wells. But it takes real forethought, and it takes not just drilling and fracking a well and putting it on production. You actually have to think about now over the next 10 years, we're going to drill 5,000 wells, and they're going to be over this sort of geography. So let's start a pipeline system now that can collect that water, move it around, clean it up, as opposed to having 18-wheel trucks, hauling tankers up and down the roads, or even, rail might be a stage on the way there. But just that thought process, it's like charging yourselves $40 a ton for CO2. It changes the way you think. So if you start to see water as a precious resource, community, sort of annoying factors to the community like trucks and that type of thing, if you start to factor those into your decisions, you come up with a different answer. Lots of that we can do today. I think in the future, particularly as you think about shale gas development for oil development around the world, there's a lot of places that don't have much water. So these resources probably exist in northern Mexico. They exist in places in China where water is a real problem. So part of our research and development dollars go into how do you fracture treat a well using no water at all? What's a completely alternative way to get the same end result without using the 4 million gallons of water per well to fracture treat? So that's the combination of factors.
Next question. They need to get a mic.
Hamza Al-Jaman, PhD student in petroleum engineering at Stanford. So one of the biggest challenges in the 21st century is to have clean, sustainable energy. So we have at the top of the scale the clean, sustainable energy, and at the bottom of the scale we have the unconventional oil and gas. So my question is, how can we succeed in maintaining an energy security while at the same time move up the scale of clean, sustainable energy?
Yeah, well, again, I think we can both contribute to the answer to this question, but I would start by saying you have to be realistic and practical on the front end. So I think, maybe Rich or someone said it, you have to think about the role that fossil fuels play, and your drive can't be solely to replace those with renewable, sustainable energies. It has to also be, because of the way this demand profile will develop, how do I clean up the energies that are used today? So by promoting carbon capture and storage, where we're currently building a full-scale project in Canada to basically find ways to bring the cost of that technology down, stripping CO2 out of the fossil fuel energy source, those kind of activities are going to be absolutely critical to this long-term transition that we're going through. So I have to go back to my original premise, which is it's going to take all of these energies. It's going to take policy positions and real investment in the alternative renewable energy space so that they can grow as rapidly as possible. But a lot of that research and thought and effort has to go into how do you do fossil fuels in a cleaner way, because they are going to be used for a long, long time.
Yeah, we've grappled with that question, and we look out future of energy long term. Our scenarios are based on an energy model, a very detailed energy model, mapping supply and demand, going back into the past and extending out 50, 100 years. We are still debating the numbers for 2100, but we got as far as 2060. I think we're more or less agreed on that. And we then take these numbers, these supply and demand numbers, to a group of climate scientists at MIT, and they run our energy figures through their climate model and tell us what it means in climate terms. What's clear to us is that, yes, as we move into the 21st century, we'll use more and more non-fossil fuel energy. And the energy supply source, if you can see our supply charts and our energy demand charts, become much more variegated. We call it the rainbow effect, as more and more alternative energies start to become significant players in the energy mix. But there's no getting away from that demand for fossil fuels, which will still be there, given the rise in demand for energy globally, and there's no getting away then from technologies that will help us reduce the amount of carbon that we emit in relation to these fossil fuels.
Which among the non-fossil alternatives are most promising in your opinion?
We used to say we need all of them, and of course we do. That's very, very important. So let's not detract from that message. Having said that, in our ocean scenario, I think we pick on solar as the big winner in the renewables game over the course of this century for a number of reasons. We believe that, well, firstly, there's lots of sun in many of the places where they are looking to ramp up energy production. And it's a distributed technology, so it can be deployed. It doesn't have to be centrally coordinated, and so on and so forth. And you can then roll it out at scale. We believe, therefore, that solar will be, I think, among all the renewables, the one that stands out by about 2060.
Another point I want to make in relation to the question, and this is a lifetime, a real life testing of the scenarios as well. But I think it's safe to say that if you get away from the conceptual and you look at the end result we're after, so in this case, lower CO2 emissions would be the one I would pick based on that question. I think it's fair to say that the most important, most impactful thing that Shell can do for the next 15 to maybe 20 years is produce as much natural gas as possible and use that to displace coal in power generation. If that's the end result you're after, we can invest a lot of money in solar, which, and we're watching those technologies and nurturing those technologies, but that's the thing we'll do that actually really makes a tangible difference.
Yeah, in one of our current scenarios, gas emerges as the backbone fuel for renewables because it needs a backup fuel for energy sources that are intermittent, and it becomes the dominant primary energy source globally by around 2060 or thereabouts. So gas, what we've seen happen in the US, will be replicated in other parts of the world and as a primary energy source that really takes off, yeah.
Next question.
Oh, hi, my name is Michael Canellis. I'm a energy writer and analyst, and I'm very interested in your comments on carbon capture, and out of all the years I've covered it, that's the one technology that's always 5 to 10 years away. It's always delayed, there's always problems. It's even worse than fuel cells in a lot of ways. Why does it get delayed so often? Why is it so difficult? Is it the technology? Is it the expense? And what can turn it around? Do we need like a hefty carbon tax?
Yeah, well, I could try to answer that question around a real project. So I mentioned earlier, we're putting in a carbon capture and storage project in Canada. I won't give you the exact price tag, but it cost over $1 billion. There's no profit or return on doing that, other than it's us thinking this is going to be an important technology to have in this future world that we're talking about. And we have a partnership with the Canadian government and provincial government in Alberta, where they're putting substantial money into this as well, because this partnership wants to see this happen. So I think the main barrier is not technology, because this is buttoning together very well-known technologies. The subsurface piece is very well-known. Basically, we're putting this carbon into the type of reservoirs that we've been taking hydrocarbons out of for decades. But the cost is almost, right in today's world, it's prohibitively high. I think the difference between how you've seen this progress over time and what we're trying to drive with these public-private partnerships is the only way to bring the cost down now is through real demonstration projects. You have to do this at scale, you have to get your hands on it, and then you start to find, because we've proven this thousands of times, then you start to find ways to really reduce the cost. Now, to accelerate that whole system, I think it comes back to the last point you made, which is why, again, maybe surprising for energy companies, is we're one of the strongest advocates for a price on carbon, is you have to have some market signals to really push that as a needed technology and a viable economical thing to do.
And in our mountain scenario, we're very bullish, as you know, on CCS, and precisely for the reason that you gave, which is the technology is known, the players are able to do it, we believe, but the big blocker is the price. Yeah. And that's where we hope over the course of the years, technology and innovation will come to help bring down that price.
Joe, a lot of Silicon Valley can find its roots in military research. Yeah. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency was instrumental in getting the internet going. NASA was instrumental in buying a lot of the first semiconductor chips put out by Fairchild and others. What's the state of military research around the world insofar as it thinks about future energy sources?
Well, what strikes me, and I'm sure that plenty of views on that topic around the room, what strikes me is the interest the military has in, one, renewable energy, and two, concerns for national security around possible climate impacts. And I'm aware that work has been commissioned, work has been done. I don't closely follow it myself, although I have a connection with the National Intelligence Council, Matt Burrows, and the scenarios that they brought out last year. But they are aware that these technologies, these changes, will change the whole picture from a security point of view, and therefore they need to think how that might play out and what they should do about it.
I'm beginning to think I'm interviewing M and 007 here, but next question.
Could I just add one more thing? Yeah. I mean, if I look at big investments, think in this country of the Eisenhower Interstate Highway Program. Now that had a very strong national security component.
Yeah, it came out of the defense budget.
Absolutely. But so huge sums of money were poured into it, but it became also, at the end of the day, a huge economic booster for the US economy.
Hello, I'm Justin Wick from Viking Venture, a venture capital firm here, investing in oil and gas and IT. And what we see is that, and I will follow up your comment on Silicon Valley within oil and gas. We do see a lot of technology developed here in the Silicon Valley, which can be used in the oil and gas companies. But the most important thing I see from the oil and gas companies is the activity they do as a demanding customer. So it would be good if you can elaborate a bit on what do you do on purchasing new technology in another way than you do today.
Yeah, how do you guys interact with Silicon Valley, both in terms of R&D, purchasing Silicon Valley's technology, acquiring kind of Silicon Valley companies? What do you do now, and do you think you will see yourselves more aggressively engaged with the likes of Silicon Valley going forward?
Well, so a couple of thoughts from me is, I think the paths we're on are absolutely parallel and interacting all the time. In terms of some direct examples, the just sheer computing power and the tools that we use to better understand what happens subsurface, deep into the geology of the earth. If we're going to drill for wells and recover these sources of energy, what's the best way to do it? What's the best way to get the most out with the least amount of footprint? You start to trail down the various technologies that requires, and seismic imaging is one that always comes to mind when we talk about computing power and the ability to write algorithms to interpret and so forth. So that's always a very rich area. The idea of nanotechnology to actually crawl through a reservoir with something that can give you feedback and tell you exactly what's going on is a new, very rich area that I think will have a big impact. I think we could carry on those kind of examples for a long time. But.
What's interesting, Rich, you began with a comment about the pace of change in the energy business being more modest, more moderate than what you see here.
No, I said that would be the Silicon Valley perception.
Or perception. Yeah. But really, what's going on is not the technologies per se, but the intermarriages between different technologies that matter. So a lot of the stuff that's going on here would be highly relevant for the oil and gas industry, but it has to marry itself with the sorts of things, the huge infrastructure projects that are going on as part of the energy business. So it's that interconnection between the two that we need to look to and change. There is, you refer to Moore's law, there is a change also, there is a sense, if you look at emerging energy technologies in the 20th century, they took a long time coming, 20, 30 years before they could even get 1% of the energy market, and then of course they take off after that. But it's a recognition that that's not a physical law, it's a man-made law, and that can change and has changed in the past. So there's always this question that we have, what's the sense of urgency? What's the sense of urgency around renewables? What's the sense of urgency around other technology, around other energy sources as well that can bring that technological innovation to bear?
Well, you surprised me, and then we'll get to the next question. You surprised me by saying you're in favor of a carbon tax.
Yeah.
Tell us why. Is that because a carbon tax would give us a sense of urgency? That's the Tom Friedman argument.
Well, I think it absolutely creates those market forces that we're looking for that will be necessary to transform the energy mix around the world. It's an understanding and a belief that transition is actually necessary and needs to happen, that things like carbon capture and storage all the way to solar developments need to happen. And it's an understanding that we see a way to be a very viable business in that world, and we'd kind of like to get on with it, frankly. And so, again, you see us pushing very hard for a price on carbon. But I wanted to, give you a real example too, because I think you may have some other examples in mind. But the last technology from Silicon Valley that I know we picked up and we're promoting somewhere was a company, and I may get this wrong, but I think the company's name was GlassPoint. So this is a solar thermal steam generation company, for industrial use, generating steam. And part of the new innovation, beyond just the generator, was the idea of you effectively put these pieces of equipment in glass houses that can kind of self-clean themselves for dust and sand and so forth, that really can lower the efficiency of that solar conversion process. And not only was it a great idea, but it appears that it works, and that's something that in our joint venture in Oman, we're now building on a demonstration basis to see whether or not we should expand it further.
Next question.
My name is Ed Beardsworth. I'm an independent consultant advising energy startups. I was intrigued by the comment going back to 1913. I don't have to go back that far, say 1930, and someone tries to describe to you a nuclear power plant. Simply does not exist. It's not in your imagination. You can't even begin to sort of put your mind around it. It's my premise that there is physics that we don't know now that we will know in 10, 20, 30 years. How do you take into account and how do you approach the question of things we don't know yet that might change everything?
That's a great question. I would just add that in the early 1800s, there was great concern about the whale blubber shortage in the world. And shortly after that, the first oil well was drilled and a whole new era began.
I think Cho should start on this one.
I'll hand over to you, Marvin. But basically, I'm not doing a formal presentation here, but one picture I like to use when I do a formal presentation introducing the way we like to think long term is a picture of downtown Rochester, New York State, at the turn in the early 20th century. And it showed three forms of transportation. It showed horse and buggy, it showed trams, and it showed the first motor vehicles. And the question that I always have for everyone in the room is, which do you think of these three will win out over the course of the 20th century? Well, we know the answer, that the horse and buggy was doomed. But the point is that we may not be able to fully discern what the new technology will be in the 20th century, but we can see, at least as far as the areas we are looking at, what are the promising new technologies coming forward. We may not be able to tell how CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, or fracking will work out, but we know what the technology, what questions the technology will need to address. So on fracking, as Marvin has pointed out, it really needs to address the water problem very urgently. So we know these are the areas that we will need to come to. Now, the big unanswered question around, you mentioned nuclear power. The big unanswered question we always have is around the whole question about nuclear fission and what we understand by nuclear fission. And that, you know, the skeptics always say that's always 50 years into the future. We can keep pushing it forwards. We don't know the answer, and I cannot give you an answer on that. But we do know where to begin to tackle the problem.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is thinking about then running, you know, this company on a day-to-day basis. I think two things stand out to me as being important, and one of those is, just like Cho said, we don't know when and where that may come. But so it's important for us to have, you know, back to sort of my fingertips, you have to have your feelers out there to know what's developing, and that you're constantly thinking about what would a business model be around that innovation, and how might we play a role in that, or not. Some of them, frankly, we just wouldn't or couldn't. But the other question I would ask myself is, you know, everybody dreams of a breakthrough like that, but at the same time, would we just sit on our hands and not work all these other things in the meantime, because we might actually need all these other things? And so I can see you'd say the same on that point.
Next question.
Neil Jacobstein, Stanford Media X. Shell has been utilized in scenario planning since the 1970s.
And Neil's a faculty member of Singularity University too,
right? Where
they think about the impact of Moore's Law kinds of technologies in a host of more traditional industries.
Yes. So Shell has been utilizing scenario planning since the 1970s, thanks to Peter Schwartz and his team. How have you changed your operational decision-making capability to respond to new scenarios that are driven by a world of accelerating exponential change?
Shall I begin?
Yeah, why don't you start?
Okay, I mean, let me put it this way.
Like I said, it's a learning session for me as well.
Let me put it this way. I mean, I've been in the scenario team since 1994, so almost 20 years. And I find it's a unique experience. Marvin referred to our independence, it's a unique experience to be part of a team sitting inside the heart of Shell, very close to the people, never mind the structure, to the actual individuals who have to make the key decisions for Shell, and being able to understand what their concerns are and then bring our learnings to bear, our understandings which we take from a range of sources, as I've already said, to bear on these critical decisions. So from that point of view, there we go again, I feel unique, uniquely placed, and in this extraordinary position of being able to actually set a map, set a context for key decisions within the company. So from that point of view, that fundamental principle remains the same and has always been the same. You know, how do we understand the context in which we make better decisions? I don't, thankfully, have to make those decisions, but I have to give that context, and I have to place that context for the decision makers.
Right, but the question was about how the decision-making system has changed
Yeah.
to respond to the increasing rate of change. So how are they responding now to your scenario?
I have a comment on that, but I don't know if, Marvin, you'd like to start on that first, and then I'll comment on
the
that.
word that keeps coming to my mind when you ask that question is how do we test resiliency over a number of different scenarios? And so we do, that's exactly what we do. And some of those are pretty far-fetched, and we make investments that in some cases wouldn't be viable in some of those. But then it's all about the balance of the total portfolio. So the same way we would typically run, you could ask me that question about country risk around the world, and how do we get a balanced portfolio so that in a completely unpredictable and volatile world, we're likely still happy with the overall outcome in those various cases. It's the same thing in this case.
Well, I will pitch the executive program at Singularity as it would be worth your while to do it.
Just a very quick comment, Rich. You know, I'm really struck by the question about, you know, we live in an ever fast-changing world. I'm sure that comment has always been there all the time. And when the Scenario team was founded in the early 70s, I think that perception was there, that the world was changing faster than we can get a handle on, and therefore we need some people around who can actually give it a shape and a direction which would help our decision making. So that question has always been there, and it's always informed the decision makers. There is actually a very good article that's just come out in the Harvard Business Review, I don't know if you've seen it, by two people I know very well, both former colleagues, now both at Oxford, in which they talked about the very rigid planning system which Shell had before the 1970s, and how that began to evolve as a consequence of the big shifts in the global energy system that we saw over the course of that decade.
Well, final question.
A question and just a quick correction. It was a gentleman named Pierre Vach who actually started scenario planning at Shell, not me. My name is Peter Schwartz. So you're in California. California is on a different page. Sacramento is on a different page than Washington, D.C. with respect to environmental policy. Should Washington be following Sacramento or the other way around? And wrinkle to the question, we've got a carbon cap and trading system here in California. Yeah. Would you prefer a carbon tax to that?
Yeah, so I'll start on that since I spent a little time in Sacramento, or not in Sacramento, but with the governor this week. You know, frankly, for where Shell sits and the advocacy where we are, if those of you that are familiar with AB 32, which I think has led to the cap and trade system and so forth, we were strong supporters of that program. We were strongly in opposition to Proposition 23, I think, which was to shut all that down. And to me, it goes back to the question that we had about a price on carbon as well. As we look at all these potentially very volatile futures, you can certainly see one where if you believe climate change is real and that we have an impact on that, you could see following a path where you sort of do nothing, you have some dramatic event, and then you try for dramatic change. Now that may likely be the outcome, but a better outcome would be if we start a transition and start to change over time, and that's, again, one of the reasons why we would say a price on carbon is a smart thing to do now, because it allows that transition to start to happen. But on the environmental topics, specifically as the question goes to cap and trade and CO2 emissions, we'd be closer to where California is today than we would be where Washington is, undoubtedly. We prefer a cap and trade system, but we understand that we don't make that choice. So we have some sort of principles which say you need to think about which are make it as broad as possible, meaning include as much of CO2 emissions under that umbrella of whatever system you have as possible. Not just power plants, but other large facilities, other sources of CO2, and make it as market-based as possible. You know, cap and trade, we think, actually is the way that, you know, the cap gives you the absolute result you're looking for, and you can ratchet that down over time, so you're clear about the outcome. And the trading piece allows you to go after the lowest cost sources of CO2 reduction. That's why we like it.
Cho, you have the final word. And by the way, Cho is going to be around for another half hour, so if you want to come up and talk to him, you can, but you can wrap it up.
Okay, thank you, Rich. And just in responding to Peter, I mean, I'll just say this, that in developing the 2008 long-term energy scenarios, we had a very intense, and I should say bitter debate in the scenario team over the relative merits of cap and trade versus carbon tax. And we came out in favor of a trading system for various reasons. But, you know, at the end of the day, what I would say is we need to tackle the climate problem. Both our current scenarios, mountains and oceans, tell us that we are on an unsustainable pathway in climate terms, and therefore we need to act very urgently. And therefore, I will take anything that's going, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Tell me if you disagree, Marvin.
No, that's why I say, you know, we don't choose, so we want to work in any system, but yeah.
Well, let's thank you very much, gentlemen. Let's give them a big hand.
So on behalf of Churchill Club and our audience, again, want to really thank Marvin and Cho for sharing your perspectives so thoughtfully and so freely with us. Rich, as always, your expert guidance of the conversation. We have a small token of our appreciation for you. It is the Churchill Club speaker T-shirt.
All right, fantastic.
Please wear that in very good health.
I'll wear it with pride.
Dress for next time, yeah.
Wonderful. And as Rich said, Cho will be sticking around and I think actually presenting from the stage for about a half hour or so, but we will take a 5-minute break because we do have some ice cream for you out in the lobby. But we will come back in 5 minutes and then Cho will be able to dive into the scenarios in a little more detail for those of you who are interested. You have been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.